The Lord of the Rings have once again been re-released, but this time they've been remastered and re-released to theaters, in IMAX, in 4K. And I saw them, and I loved it.
The ring passed to Isildur, who had this one chance to destroy evil forever.
I absolutely love them. There isn't a trilogy that's even in the same hemisphere as these three, so seeing them in theaters was a real treat. I was approximately 5 years old when The Fellowship of the Ring came out, so I wasn't able to see it in theaters, and even if I did, I wouldn't remember. So this is the first time I was able to see 1 and 2 in theaters. I had seen 3 in theaters before, Return of the King, but I'd never seen the other 2. And even now, I look back on this experience of watching these 3 movies, and I think to myself, this is the first time I've ever watched these movies without taking a break, getting a snack, looking at my phone. It's the first time I've sat through the 3-hour, and in the Return of the King case, 3.5, almost 4-hour runtime straight through. And there's a lot of things I noticed about these movies that I never have before that I would like to talk about. So let's start with The Fellowship of the Ring.
Middle-earth. The third age of this world.
For the longest time, I've said that this is my favorite of the trilogy, and I still think that's true, mainly because it's very streamlined. I mean, the main story is just Frodo gets a ring, he goes to a place, a bunch of people rally around him, and they try to go take the ring to another place to destroy it. That's an incredibly truncated version of the plot, and of course there are other plot lines going on, like Aragorn's romance with Arwen and Saruman the White turning evil, and yada yada. There's a couple other plot lines, but it's a very simple, very focused movie, which is why I think I like it the most. It's not juggling a whole lot, and yet it is still a great, very impressive movie. From the very get-go, this movie changes so much in tone and in genre even, which I think is why I like it so much. It's the only one out of the trilogy that switches between like a laid-back comedy to a horror movie to a thriller to a drama to an action movie. It almost hits every single genre of film that you can in one movie. And it does it all super well. It balances everything super well. And seeing it in theaters really just drove that home for me. Because, again, this movie is 3 hours long. And yet, not one moment feels unfocused. Not one moment feels like filler here. Everything blends super well story-wise. And the pacing is wonderful. There are a couple things that I noticed about this 4K remaster that I'm not too fond of. One being the visual effects. I mean, this movie is 20 years old now, so you can't expect the top-of-the-line Avengers Endgame type of visual effects where everything on screen is a visual effect and it all looks top-notch. There's very few visuals in this movie, visual effects, which is good because most of them don't hold up very well. It is a dated movie. It even has that kind of jerky slow motion from the 90s, and all 3 of them have it, and I've never loved that effect in any of them, but I'd say this is the most dated of all, and the remaster doesn't help that either. I think what they tried to do was make the visual effects a little bit clouded by adding motion blur. So there's scenes with like the cave troll.
They have a cave troll.
Where there is like motion blur added to try and hide the date of the visual effects. Now they're not replacing the visual effects or adding in new visual effects like with the Star Wars debacle. But that doesn't mean that adding motion blur was a good idea either. It just doesn't look great. I don't know if I prefer just the horrible visual effects from like the 2011 Blu-ray or the motion blurred ones from this one. I think I may prefer just the horrible ones because you can actually see things. I mean, in the action scenes in this movie, there's so much motion blur from the camera moving and from the visual effects that it's actually difficult to see things sometimes. It's actually difficult to understand what's going on with the action on screen. And that's something that I really only noticed with this one, which may also be an effect of one thing I noticed in this is the extreme close-ups. There's a lot of very tight close-ups on people's faces in this one, more so than the other ones, which I can understand because a lot of the dialogue's very dramatic, it's very serious, so having extreme close-ups makes sense. There's even a scene with Gandalf and Saruman where they're talking back and forth, and almost every shot is an extreme close-up. But in an action scene where the camera's moving and there's motion blurred visual effects, it gets a little nauseating. So seeing that on the big screen was a little weird. It felt a little wonky. But what makes up for this is the sound design. Seeing it on the big screen was a really great experience, and the sound designers of this are unsung heroes. It's incredible. The sound in this is absolutely amazing. The Balrog, which is another visual effect that looks great, by the way. One thing that I love about these movies, though, is the fact that these are the last of their kind. These blockbusters are the last of their kind. All three of the Lord of the Rings movies had the budget of one Hobbit movie. So that tells you how much money they're dealing with, which is not a lot, really. It is a lot in comparison to some other movies, but even in like the behind the scenes, Peter Jackson is quoted saying, "This is the biggest low-budget movie of all time." And it kind of feels that way because they use every trick in the book.
In the shot where Frodo is pouring tea for Gandalf at a table, and the camera kind of crabs past from one side of the table to the other side, and in that instance, Ian McKellen was actually sitting on a dolly that was actually moving him slightly on a small-scale table with small-scale props. And it was not too far from a full-size table, a Frodo-sized table with larger Frodo-sized props.
They used forced perspective, they used matte paintings, they used half-sized, quarter-sized, full-size sets, they used just compositing, blue screen, green screen, visual effects, miniatures, models, you name it, they used it in this movie, and it all looks amazing. I mean, the king's statues that they row past are literally just styrofoam models. And they look incredible. The Two Towers is my least favorite of the trilogy. I think this is the weakest for me, and seeing it in IMAX just confirmed it. Watching the first one and the third one gave me these visceral reactions. When the first one ended, I was literally just sitting in my seat with my eyes closed, just like just letting it wash over me. And the third one, there was multiple moments where I was just hit with this wave of emotion, seeing all of this stuff that I've loved so much for so many years. The second one didn't do that at any point. Now, that's not to say that it's not a good movie. It's amazing, and it's incredibly ambitious. The problem is there is so much going on in this movie. There is so many plot lines to follow, and at times it feels like things get lost. Because you have the Fellowship fractured. You have Pippin and Merry being taken by these Uruks, Aragorn, Legolas, Gimli following them. Gandalf battles the Balrog at the beginning of the movie, comes back later in the movie and meets up with Aragorn and those guys. Then you have Frodo and Sam doing their thing. They meet with Gollum. Then you have the Aragorn and Gimli, Legolas, and Gandalf, and they go to the Rohirrim. You introduce Rohan and the characters there, Theoden and Éowyn, and then you have Frodo run into Gondor and Faramir and the Rangers there, and then Merry and Pippin meet up with the trees. So there is so much going on in this movie that it can't quite juggle perfectly. Now, it does as well as it can, I think, but there just is too much. But this movie, it seems like, is everyone's favorite. A lot of people say that this is the best one of the trilogy, and every time I ask why, the answer is typically for Helm's Deep, which I understand. I don't have an argument against that. I think Helm's Deep is one of the most ambitious action scenes ever put to screen. They built full-sized sets of Helm's Deep, the castle, quarter-size sets, miniatures. They did everything for this. The amount of extras they have, the amount of work put into building everything, the costumes on display, the fact that it's raining the whole time, and I'm sure that was miserable. It's so impressive. And this whole movie is super impressive. On a technical level, this may be the best one, the most impressive one, because it is juggling so much, and it does it all so well. There is one after another plot lines that are these large-scale action sequences that are as good as the last. And I don't know how you do that. So, super impressive stuff in this movie. The sound design, again, is the unsung hero of it. Seeing Helm's Deep, seeing the trees, seeing all this stuff on the big screen in IMAX with that surround sound was awesome. I loved that. I didn't notice any bad motion blurred visual effects in this one, and even the extreme close-ups from the first one all but go away. I mean, they're still there, because Peter Jackson loves the extreme close-up, but it's definitely not as noticeable as it was in the first one. They don't use it as much. And there is still super impressive cinematography. I mean, they flew a helicopter into Edoras and used it to shoot some scenes. That's crazy to me. I don't know. It's just crazy. This movie is crazy. I still love it. So don't take me begrudging the fact that you lose some character stuff in favor of some action, dissuade you from seeing it, because I think it's great. So let's move on. I loved seeing this in IMAX. I think it was the best experience I had out of the trilogy in IMAX. It was incredible. I don't know what it was specifically, but this one feels the most relentlessly paced. The 3 hour and 40 or 50 minute runtime absolutely zips by. I saw it at 7:15 at night, and I didn't get out till 10:30, and I was like, oh, where'd the time go? It went quicker than some 90-minute movies for me. It just zips. And that is because the first two do such a great job of establishing the characters, establishing the world, that it doesn't need to do a whole lot of that in this. So everything feels a little bit more contained. Everything feels a little bit more focused. I think it does have an issue about the first 20 minutes, where it kind of has that Helm's Deep, Two Towers issue of a little bit too much is going on, and it feels a little janky. There's a little bit too much of, we're going here, okay, now we're here, okay, now we're here, okay, now we're here, okay, now we're here, and then things start to come together. When Gandalf gets to Minas Tirith with Pippin, the movie just rockets off. I don't know where the time went. I was shocked when it ended. There is so much going on in this, and yet it feels so tight. You have Frodo, Sam, Gollum. They get to Minas Morgul with where the Witch King is. They encounter Shelob. They get to Mount Doom. You have Legolas, Gimli, Gandalf. They're with the Rohirrim. They just fought in Helm's Deep. Gandalf and Pippin go to Minas Tirith. And yet it feels so much more contained. There's still a lot going on, and yet everything feels more motivated here. Everything feels like the characters are making decisions. The decision made to go to Minas Tirith with Gandalf and Pippin makes sense because they find this ball in the water, the Palantir, and Sauron sees Pippin with it and he thinks he has the ring, so they go to Minas Tirith to warn them about the oncoming war. So that makes sense. There's so much in this that feels motivated, that feels like the characters are making decisions, and I think that's why it's so zippy. Plus, the majority of this movie is just action. Seems to be what the Battle of the Five Armies tried to do and completely failed at, because A, you don't care about the characters, B, the pacing sucks, and C, the armies come out of nowhere, which is the most uninteresting thing about action. When armies or action or battles just happen, that's not interesting. But here, everything makes sense. Everything's been building to this, and it was amazing to see. I loved seeing these characters, and I love seeing the action in this. The action seems to be handled a lot better in this as well. You go from the extreme close-up motion blurred of the first one to these wonderful wide shots that are quick cutting, but wide shots so you can see what's going on. And everyone has things to do. Merry is fighting with the Rohirrim, Pippin's fighting with Gondor, Gandalf's with him, Frodo, Sam, Gollum, they're doing their thing with Shelob, Legolas, Gimli, and Aragorn, how did I forget that, are with the Rohirrim, then they go find the army of the dead. There's so much going on, and it all makes sense. As far as things I noticed about this one that I didn't before, there wasn't a whole lot. I do think the 4K remaster does help some scenes. It looks incredible. I think the most jarring part about this movie is the fact that it's a personal thing, really. I've seen this one the most extended. So there are so many scenes watching the theatrical edition that cut from a scene to another scene, and there's an extended bit in the middle of that that I absolutely love. And there are some moments in the theatrical where I audibly gasped when there wasn't that extended scene, because I had forgotten that it wasn't there. The mouth of Sauron is not here. One of my favorite parts of the movie. The relationship between Éowyn and Faramir, not there. One of my favorite parts of the movie. There is so much in this that's cut out of the theatrical. The Saruman stuff. Saruman gets killed by Wormtongue. Don't see any of that. You don't see any of that. The extended edition of The Return of the King, I think, is the best. Now, does it make the movie 4.5 hours? Yes. Yes, it does. And yet, it's my preferred version. There is one after another extended scene that I think highly benefits this movie.
My master, Sauron the Great, bids thee welcome.
Of all these movies, if you haven't seen them, I would highly recommend going and watching them. They're some of my favorite movies, just period. I love these movies. I love all three of them. I think the first one's the best, third one's the next, second one's the weakest, but even that one is amazing. That's most people's favorite, so that tells you something about the quality of these three. If you were to see them for the first time, I would definitely suggest watching the extended edition of The Fellowship, theatrical of The Two Towers, and extended of The Return of the King. I think that is the best way to watch these. I think that is the way that you get the most out of the story. You understand the communities, the characters. All of that is fleshed out way better in that way to watch it. So yeah, check them out.